Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and this is Sam. Today we're asking about bringing uninvited guests, because one extra person is never just one extra chair, right?
Right, because the awkward part is that it sounds small while it quietly changes the whole plan. Food was bought for a number, seats were arranged for a number, and now somebody has to scramble.
Exactly, and that's why we're starting with the basic complaint. The starting take that an uninvited guest changes cost, space, and control fast. Sam, start us off.
Okay, here's the part that bugs people. Somebody says, "Hey, I invited one more person," like they're adding a napkin, not another human being. And suddenly you're supposed to smile like the whole plan didn't just shift under your feet.
Yeah, but let's not pretend every extra guest is a catastrophe. The fair question is, what actually changes? Cost, space, mood, or just your sense that you lost control?
It is control, though. That's the annoying part. If you're hosting, you built the thing around a number, even loosely, and one extra body can mean one less chair, one more plate, one more drink, and one more person who now has to be folded into the social machine.
Right, but there's a difference between this is rude and inconvenient and this is a disaster. A backyard hangout with extra chips is not the same species of problem as a dinner party with a set table or a wedding with fixed counts.
Exactly. And people love acting like the difference is morally obvious in the direction of, relax, it's just one person. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It's usually said by the person who did not buy the food, set the room, or spend the afternoon trying to keep the thing from getting weird.
So the real issue isn't the arithmetic. It's whether the host can absorb the change without making the whole thing feel off. If they can, one extra guest is small. If they can't, it's not small just because the invitee is a single body. Where would you draw the line, though? Because if we're honest, sometimes people hear uninvited guest and immediately jump to disaster. And sometimes they hear, it's fine, and pretend nothing changed. I want the middle ground, where the actual burden lives.
I draw it at the point where the host stops being able to host the thing they agreed to host. That could be money, it could be seats, it could be food, or it could just be the fact that the whole vibe changes from I invited my people to I'm now managing a little surprise population increase.
And that's the part people skip over, because they treat mood like fluff. It isn't fluff. If the room gets crowded, if someone feels like a tag-along, if the host starts doing little emergency math in their head, the event has changed, even if nobody says it out loud.
Yeah, and once you notice that, the complaint stops sounding dramatic. It's not, one extra guest broke civilization. It's, one extra guest can force the host to spend attention, money, and social energy they didn't plan to spend. That's not nothing.
Can I push that a little? Because sometimes the host really can absorb it, and then the complaint is less about burden and more about preference. Like if there's extra food, extra chairs, and the extra person is actually someone the group would enjoy, the practical hit is tiny.
Sure, and that's why I don't want a fake hard rule. I'm not saying every uninvited guest ruins everything. I'm saying the people minimizing it are usually acting like the host planning doesn't count unless the room is literally on fire.
And planning is the key part, because hosts are not just buying food, they're deciding the size of the room, the tone of the conversation, and how much social friction they can handle. One extra guest can be harmless, but it can also make the whole thing feel less like a plan and more like a group project somebody edited without asking.
Right, and that's the part I think people are reacting to. Not just more people, but you changed my event after I already set it up. That can be fine in some cases, but it is never as neutral as people try to make it sound. Okay, so let's separate the thing people say from the thing that actually happens. The phrase "no big deal" is not annoying because one extra person is a moral emergency. It is annoying because it tells the host their reaction is already being waved away before they even get to have one.
Right. It sounds casual, but it lands like the decision has already been made for you. And the host is the one who has to deal with the extra plate, the extra seat, the extra food, the extra awkwardness if the room was already full.
Exactly. Nobody is usually mad at the person as a human being. They're mad at the moment where they realize they have to smile and silently redo the night while somebody else keeps acting like nothing changed.
And that is what people underestimate. The host is not just counting heads. They're checking food, seating, rides, noise, whether everybody fits comfortably, whether the plans still make sense, and whether the event still feels like the event they actually agreed to host.
Right. And the annoying part is that it can be a small change and still be a real change. That's where the resentment starts. The person saying, "it's just one more," is often acting like small and irrelevant mean the same thing, and they do not.
So the emotional reaction is partly about being talked down to, but it's also about the host having to.
Yeah, and about being asked to absorb work that somebody else is calling nothing.
Fair. And to be clear, the extra person is not always a big deal. If there is room, enough food, and the host says yes, then this is not a crisis. The point is that the yes has to come from the host, not from the person arriving late with a shrug.
Exactly. Because when somebody says, "it's just one more," they are skipping the part where the host gets to decide whether one more actually fits. That decision is the whole thing. If the host is supposed to be in charge of the night, then you don't get to treat their answer like a formality.
And sometimes it isn't even mostly about money. It is about control in the ordinary sense. The host planned a certain number of people, a certain kind of energy, a certain shape to the room, and now somebody else is trying to move that boundary without asking first.
That's why it feels like a small override. Not dramatic, not evil, just enough to make you feel like your plan has to bend around somebody else's convenience. And that is the part people hear and immediately want to minimize, because it sounds petty until you are the one doing the bending.
And the awkward part is the host has to stay pleasant while that happens. You can be annoyed and still polite, but it is work to keep your face normal while you're deciding in real time whether the room can actually handle another person.
Yeah, the smile is doing a lot of work there. You're talking to people while your brain is going, okay, where do they sit? What do they eat? Did I already promise that chair to somebody else? Is this now a louder night than I wanted? And do I have to pretend I'm fine with all of it?
That mental load is a big part of why the phrase bothers people. It may be a tiny ask for the person making it. It is not a tiny ask for the person who has to absorb the ripple effect and keep everything feeling normal while they do it.
And that is why the honest version is so much better. If you want to bring someone, you ask. You don't wave your hand and call it nothing. Because once you do that, you are not just being casual. You're making the host argue for their own boundary.
Which is the part people bristle at. The invite list is not just logistics. It is part of how the host decided the night would work. The number matters less than the fact that the host is the one who set it up, and someone else is trying to revise it on the fly.
And the distinction matters because not every extra guest is the same thing. If a partner was already expected, that's one thing. If somebody turns up with a surprise extra person and assumes the host will just absorb it, that's a different move entirely.
Yeah, and the fair version is not never bring anyone. The fair version is, don't tell the host their answer already belongs to you. If there is slack, fine. If there is no slack, then calling it no big deal is just a way to skip the actual conversation.
Right. And once you put it that way, you can see why the lazy answer always sounds off. It is not a neutral description of the situation. It is somebody trying to keep the benefit of the extra guest while making the host feel silly for noticing the cost.
Exactly. So the real question is not whether one extra body can ever be harmless. It clearly can, in a loose enough setting. The real question is whether the host actually agreed to it. Because if they didn't, no big deal is just a slogan for not having to ask.
Okay, so the lazy answer people reach for is basically, relax, it's one more body. Like the universe hands out extra chairs, extra plates, extra parking, and extra emotional patience for free.
Which is only true if the event already had slack built into it. If you were planning a loose hangout, sure, one extra person might barely register. But if the thing was tight from the start, one more body is exactly how you turn a clean plan into a scramble.
Right, and this is where people get annoying on purpose. They hear the complaint and pretend you're saying one guest is a catastrophe. No, I'm saying the stupid phrase no big deal can be doing a lot of cover-up work.
That framing is cleaner. Because the problem is not that every extra guest changes every event in the same way. The problem is that people use the same dismissive line for a backyard cookout, a small dinner, a packed apartment, and a carefully timed reservation. And those are not the same situation.
Exactly. If you invited 6 people to your apartment and someone adds a 7th without asking, that is not philosophically neutral. It can mean one less seat, one more plate, one more awkward squeeze around the table, and now the host is pretending that all of that was part of the plan.
And even when the cost is small, the control issue is still real. People act like the host is being precious, but the host was the one doing the estimating. If somebody else changes the count, they're not just adding a person, they're changing the plan.
So what's the fair version of the minimizer's point? Because I don't want to straw man the one case where it actually is fine.
The fair version is that some gatherings are genuinely elastic. If it's a big, casual thing with room to spare, food that can stretch, and a host who doesn't care about the exact head count, then one extra person might not matter much. In that case, saying it's fine is just accurate, not rude.
Yeah, but that's the part people skip. They don't say, this is one of the loose ones. They say, come on, it's just one person. Like that sentence magically applies everywhere. It doesn't. A generous rule only works when the host actually built the night to be generous.
Exactly. The minimizer is right only when the event already has breathing room. If there are extra chairs, extra food, and nobody is counting on a precise head count, then the social cost can be close to zero. But if the event is small and planned tightly, the same phrase becomes a way of deleting the host's work.
And people know the difference more than they admit. If you ask first, the whole thing sounds cooperative. If you just show up with someone, now the host has to decide in real time whether to be gracious or to protect the plan they already made.
That's the real fracture. It's not only about the extra mouth to feed. It's about whether the host gets treated like the person whose preference matters or like the person who should quietly absorb whatever change somebody else just decided was minor.
Right, because one extra person at a backyard hangout is one thing. One extra person at a 10-person dinner is a different kind of ask, and everybody knows it. The math is simple, but the social pressure is the annoying part.
And that is why the bad first answer falls apart. It treats every event like it has the same buffer, when really, the buffer is the whole question. If the buffer is real, fine. If it isn't, saying no big deal is basically asking the host to pretend their planning did not count.
So the test is pretty simple. If the invite had no room for a +1, call it that. If it did, cool, but don't act like every plan has the same flexibility. That's where the lazy answer stops being generous and starts being fake.
Yeah, the honest version is, did this event have slack, or did I just spend somebody else's slack? That question is a lot less flattering, but it's also a lot more useful. And once you ask it, the next fight is over where that line actually belongs.
Okay, so the honest version is, we are not deciding whether one extra person is magically evil. We are deciding when just one more is basically harmless and when it quietly changes the night in a way the host did not sign up for.
Right, and those are different questions. If the event has slack, the complaint starts to look touchy. If the host was already counting chairs, food, space, or budget, then it is not touchy. It is a real change in the plan.
And that is the part people hate hearing from the host side. If I am the one paying, cooking, cleaning, or managing the whole circus, I get some say over the shape of it. Am I crazy to think that asking is not some big moral tragedy? It is just basic respect?
No, that is the strongest version of your point. The fair version is not the host owns other human beings. It is that the host is the one who has to live with the result. So surprise additions are not automatically free. If you want to bring somebody, asking is the polite move because the host is absorbing the consequence, not the person making the suggestion.
Exactly. Even when the extra guest is perfectly nice, the annoying part is that the host's planning margin gets treated like it belongs to everybody else. And that can change depending on the relationship, too. If it is your sister and she assumed her partner was included, that is a different conversation from a coworker deciding your invite came with a hidden bonus feature. Joe, am I overstating how much that changes the ethics of it?
No, I think that part matters. Close relationships buy more grace because people share assumptions, habits, and sometimes the same social circle. So a surprise is easier to absorb. But that is still different from a host who actually had space and food for it. Some events really do have a lot of slack, though. Open house, backyard hang, buffet, people drifting in and out. In that case, one more body is often just one more chair, not a social emergency. Which is why I do not want to pretend every uninvited guest is
a catastrophe. Yeah, fair.
Exactly. That is why I want the clean distinction. A small dinner party with counted portions and a fixed table is not the same thing as a loose drop-in gathering where the host already expected some drift. Close relationships can make a surprise easier to absorb, but they do not erase the math when the plan is tight. The more fragile the setup, the more the surprise guest matters.
So what part of this is actually fair when people get defensive? Because I think some hosts also use my event, my rules as a cover for being weirdly territorial about anything that feels slightly out of their control. But that does not mean the original complaint is fake. Sometimes the host is not being controlling. Sometimes they're just trying to keep a night from getting bigger, louder, and more expensive than they planned.
Yeah, that is the useful middle ground. The question is not whether the host is allowed to notice the extra person. Of course they are. The question is whether the added person changes the event enough to matter. And relationship usually changes how much grace people get. Cost, space, mood, and the host's sense of control all matter. But not every event has all four in play. A barbecue with extra folding chairs is one thing. A carefully plated dinner in a small apartment is another.
That is the standard I can live with. If the extra person leaves the plan basically intact, fine. If it changes the food, seating, energy, or forces the host to shuffle their night around somebody else's assumption, then just one more is not neutral anymore. It is the guest spending the host's flexibility like it was theirs to spend.
And that sets up the next question pretty cleanly. When people say it was no big deal, are they describing the actual event or just dodging the part where they made the host absorb the inconvenience? That is where the receipts matter, because the details decide whether this was harmless flexibility or lazy entitlement. Okay, so let's get out of the vibe argument and talk about what headcount actually does to a host's night. Because if the only complaint is, I was annoyed, that's one thing. If the complaint is, the plan broke, that's a different animal.
Yeah, and people act like an extra person is a decorative touch. Like you just add one more human and the room politely stretches for them. It doesn't. The room notices.
Right. The boring truth is that dinner party advice keeps coming back to the same thing. Make a plan ahead of time. Keep the guest list small if you want the night to stay manageable. And you're literally cooking for fewer mouths. That sounds dull until you've been the one trying to get everything on the table at the same time.
Which is such a non-glamorous answer, but it's the real one. Food is not imaginary. If you plan for 8 and someone quietly drags that into 9, now somebody is slicing smaller, stretching sides, or doing that fake host smile while mentally rearranging dinner.
And that ripple starts before anybody sits down. You may have bought the right amount of food, but now you're checking whether there are enough plates, enough forks, enough glasses, enough napkins, enough room on the counter, enough oven space, enough serving bowls. One extra person can turn a simple setup into a little inventory problem.
Exactly. And it's not because hosts are delicate flowers who can't handle one more chair. It's because the plan was built around a count. Once the count changes, you are not just being asked to be welcoming, you're being asked to revise the whole thing, while everyone else still gets to call it casual.
That's a good way to put it. The head count is not just a number on a text thread. It's the thing the food, the seating, and the timing are built around. And timing matters because the host is often doing a day-by-day plan, not just winging it at 6 p.m. with a bottle of wine and optimism.
That's the other part people skip. They hear one more person and think about the extra mouth. The host is thinking about whether that means more prep earlier in the day, more serving pieces, or a different order for what gets cooked first so the whole meal doesn't collapse into one stressed out pile.
And then seating becomes its own little test. There are whole guides about making seating plans because organizing who sits where is part of being a decent host, not just a fancy extra. If you add someone unexpectedly, you may have to reshuffle the table or start moving furniture around in the middle of what was supposed to be a relaxed evening.
I've seen that exact thing turn into a small domestic crisis. The host looks around, realizes the regular table doesn't cover it, and suddenly there's a folding table, a chair from another room, and a weird scramble where everybody pretends this is normal. It is normal in the sense that people do it. It is not normal in the sense that nobody had to do it because of the extra guest.
Right, and that's why the "it's only one more" line can be so irritating. Only one more what? One more plate? One more place setting? One more seat that has to exist? One more person entering a room that was already arranged to a limit? If the event was loose and nobody had to move anything, that changes the story. If people had to rearrange the room, the story is different.
So you're saying the fair version is not extra guests are always outrageous. It's extra guests are only harmless when the host actually had slack.
Exactly. And that's where the Friendsgiving example lands really cleanly. Other people brought food for a certain number of people, so the host or the group isn't just being picky about social rules. The unexpected guest can create a shortage, or at least a scramble, because the food was portioned for a known count.
That part is important because it kills the lazy defense. If everybody planned around a specific head count, the surprise isn't harmless just because the new person seems nice. Nice people still need a chair and a serving spoon. Niceness does not generate casserole.
And the capacity issue is even broader than dinner. Event layout guidance is really just saying the obvious out loud. Space planning helps determine how many people a room can actually hold, and it affects the experience and, in some settings, safety standards too. So when the host says, "No, that changes things," they're not necessarily being dramatic. They may be reacting to an actual constraint.
Which is why the annoyance feels personal even when it's not. The host isn't just protecting a mood. They're protecting the setup they already built, the food they already bought, and the timing they already tried to control. When somebody says, "It didn't change anything," they're usually saying that from outside the work.
Yeah, and that gets us to the real irritation underneath the etiquette rule. The logistics are real, so pretending otherwise is either clueless or convenient. And if the cost is obvious to the host, the only reason to blur the boundary is usually that the person crossing it doesn't want to deal with what they just added.
Okay, so let's move off the seating chart and into the uglier part. Why everybody acts like the host is supposed to absorb the inconvenience and smile.
Right, because this stops being just a logistics mistake. The guests, the hosts, and the social script all help keep it going.
And the script is basically, be easygoing, don't make a fuss, don't be the weird person who talks about head count like it matters. So the host gets trained to hear, "Can I bring someone?" as if the polite answer is always yes.
Which is how flexibility turns into a default rather than a favor. If the invitation asked for an RSVP, that isn't decorative. It's the host trying to make the plan fit reality.
Exactly. People know that when it's their own event. They want a clean yes or no because they're trying to buy food, set chairs, and not spend the night doing math in their head.
And the etiquette norm lines up with that. The basic expectation is that you don't just show up with extra people because you assumed the host would cope. If the host wants to leave room for a +1, they can say that. Otherwise, you're not entitled to the opening.
That's the part that gets slippery in group chats and casual text. Bring whoever gets treated like the default mood of every invitation, even when the actual invite was quiet, specific, and already full.
And I thought it would be okay usually means I didn't want to ask properly. It's a nicer sentence, but it's not a better one.
And I think a lot of hosts help create the mess. They don't want to say no, so they say yes too fast, and then later they're furious because they never actually wanted the extra person. They just wanted the conversation to end.
They agreed to avoid awkwardness, not because they wanted the person there.
Right, and then the guilt kicks in. Once you've said yes in that little polite panic, backing out feels rude, so you carry the annoyance instead of correcting the boundary.
Which is why the resentment shows up later. People don't always resent the guest as a person. Sometimes they resent themselves for agreeing too fast and then pretending it was fine.
And that's such a familiar little lie. No problem means I don't want the next 5 minutes to be uncomfortable. Then the night starts, the person shows up, and the host is already a little mad before anybody's even taken off their coat.
Yeah, because the boundary was never actually settled. It got deferred. And deferred boundaries are where weird social debt starts building up.
Joe, am I being too soft on the guests if I say some of them are just following the vibe instead of plotting? Like, not everybody is trying to be rude on purpose.
No, that's fair. Intent matters, but impact does too. Some people are genuinely careless rather than malicious, but "I didn't mean it" doesn't erase that they put the host in the position of having to manage their convenience.
Right, and that reluctance is part of the problem on both sides. Guests don't want to ask because they don't want to hear no, and hosts don't want to say no because they don't want to seem rigid. So everybody reaches for the path of least discomfort, and the host eats the bill for it later.
And the group chat version of it makes that worse because everything feels casual and reversible until it isn't. A quick text makes the request feel tiny. But tiny requests can still change a plan that was already built on a specific number of people.
Exactly. The casual tone lowers everybody's guard, then the actual consequence shows up in the room. That's why "I thought it would be okay" is such a slippery line. It often means nobody wanted to have the adult conversation that would have made it clear.
And to be fair, hosts can make this clearer too. If you want the invite to be tight, say so in the invite or the RSVP. If you leave it vague, people are going to test the edges because a lot of people treat vagueness as permission.
Yeah, which is annoying but not mysterious. The more you reward vague guessing, the more you get vague guessing. Then everyone acts surprised when the event feels a little off.
So the useful standard is still simple. If you're not clearly included, ask first. If you're the host, answer plainly and don't let politeness turn your answer into a maybe. That doesn't make every extra guest evil. It just stops pretending every boundary is negotiable.
Okay, so the useful line is not "extra guests are always bad." The line is when the ask stops being an ask and starts becoming pressure. Because those are two very different social moves, and people keep pretending they're the same thing.
Right. Asking first gives the host their planning power back. Assuming turns the host into the person who has to absorb your change after the fact, which is exactly why it feels off, even when the extra person is nice enough.
And people love to hide that with casual language. "Oh, I just thought I'd bring someone." No, you didn't just think it. You decided it. And then you hoped the host would be too polite to make you own it.
Exactly. Intent matters, but it doesn't erase impact. If the host counted food, seats, timing, or even just their own energy, the change lands somewhere. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it isn't. The point is that the host gets to decide that, not the guest.
So where would you draw the line then? Because this is the part people get slippery about. They hear no and act like the host is being precious, when really the host is just saying, "I planned this for a certain number of people and I don't want to be revised at the door."
I'd draw it at the first clear no. If you ask once because you genuinely need to know, that's normal. If the answer is no, the clean move is to stop. A second ask can be fine if you're clarifying something practical. But once it turns into, "Are you sure? What if? But they're already on the way," you're no longer checking facts. You're trying to wear the host down.
That's the line then. Curiosity once, pressure after that. And pressure can look very polite. It can sound gentle. It can even sound thoughtful, which is annoying because now the bad move is wearing a nicer shirt.
Yeah, polite tone does not make it less pushy. The question is whether you're giving the host room to answer or whether you're trying to move the answer. If you already know the host said no, the respectful thing is not to keep circling back until they start doubting themselves.
What about the loose invite version, though? Because there is a real difference between we're having a small dinner and come by, there will be people. If the event is already open-ended, the extra guest might genuinely not change anything.
That's fair. If the host built in slack from the start, then the event is actually flexible. But that's the key part. The flexibility has to be there already. People don't get to invent it after the fact because it would be convenient. Otherwise, they're just making the host pay for their spontaneity.
And closeness changes the tone, but not the rule. A close friend can ask with less awkwardness, sure. They might get more grace because there's trust there. But we're close is not the same thing as, I can override your plan whenever I want to be generous with somebody else.
Right, and that's the cleanest version of it. Closeness lowers the bar for asking. It doesn't lower the bar for assuming. If you want to be generous, offer it. If you want to be flexible, say so. If you want to bring someone extra, ask first, and accept no without turning it into a referendum on your character.
Okay, so the clean landing is pretty simple. Ask first, take the no, and stop acting like the host is being dramatic if the extra person actually changes the night. That is the whole thing. Not every surprise guest is a crime scene, but not every extra body is invisible either.
Yeah, no big deal is only true when the event has slack. If there's room, enough food, enough time, and the host genuinely doesn't care, one more person may barely register. If those things are tight, then the extra person isn't a rounding error. It's a real change.
And that is what people keep hand-waving away. They talk like it's one more name on a list, but the host is the one counting chairs, servings, parking, noise, and the social weirdness of suddenly being outnumbered by someone they never agreed to host. The annoying part isn't even the math. It's the way people pretend the math belongs to them.
So here's the fair version. The question isn't, is one extra person always bad? It's, does this particular event have enough slack that the addition doesn't steal anything meaningful from the host? Sam, am I overstating it if I say the line is basically whether the host still gets to enjoy their own event?
No, that's exactly it. If you add one person and nothing has to move, nothing has to stretch, and nobody gets put on the spot, fine. But if the host has to rework food, seating, timing, or the whole vibe because somebody decided an invite was optional, then no big deal is just a polite way of saying, your plan can absorb my convenience.
And that's the part where people get slippery. They act like flexibility is a virtue until it's their flexibility. Then suddenly it is very important that the host be easygoing, chill, low maintenance, not picky, not tense, not weird about it. Which is just a funny way of saying they want the other person to carry the social cost without complaining.
Right. And I don't even think most people are trying to be villains about it. A lot of the time, they're just socially lazy. They hear one extra person and think of the guest as a warm body, not as another set of preferences, another seat, another plate, another conversation the host didn't sign up to manage. It's not malicious every time. It's just inconsiderate in a way people like to dress up as casual.
And that's why I don't want to turn this into surprise guest equals automatically rude. Because sometimes the event really is loose enough that nobody cares. But the only honest standard is that the host gets to decide whether the burden matters.
And the burden gets to count even when it's small. That's the part people hate because small sounds like it should mean free. It doesn't. Small costs are still costs. And sometimes the annoyance is not the size of the burden. It's the fact that somebody else decided it didn't matter because they weren't the one absorbing it.
Which is the clean rule, I think. Ask early, ask plainly, be ready for no. And if the host says yes, don't keep acting like they owe you a higher level of enthusiasm than they offered. Permission is the point. Warmth is extra.
Yeah. If it's a roomy, casual thing and the host genuinely doesn't care, then no big deal can actually be true. But if the event is tighter, more planned, or more expensive per head, then one extra person can change cost, space, mood, and control in a way the host is absolutely allowed to notice. So the standard is simple enough. Harmless curiosity asks, entitlement assumes. Good guests protect the host's ability to plan their own night.
So, that's the end of this one. We appreciate you listening to Say the Question. Follow Say the Question, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.